I can also move over there.
Yeah, either
if
one. The
that's
mic
useful.
is not super sensitive.
I
so as
see.
long as you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
move
yeah.
it,
No, I could just move here.
sounds great.
If we just connect this to the, if we need it. So just so folks that are joining, we're just doing a quick set of discussions on the by the numbers, and then we'll start on project discussions today. So that project started primarily in terms of thinking about Gates Foundation reaching out in their role of percentage of women around the world that have actual access to health and hygiene products. And so just the number that at least jumped to us of why we really committed to that project was 80% of women in India currently do not have access to menstrual hygiene products. I mean, that's the number. So that tells you how large that problem is in terms of a country that is, it's not as if resources are limited. So it's much more complex as a question. Very specifically on plant pads and banana is the one resource that people have explored in the past in terms of thinking about making menstrual pads that are degradable. But many countries and places don't have access to banana as this as a resource. So that's another factor associated in terms of broadening and thinking. And one of the realizations, at least for us, in terms of when you're thinking about specifically for Peru, is to take a step back and ask this question for why is it that these sets of problems have existed, and some of that are very counterintuitive. For example, when we learned that people in rural contexts and rural areas actually have a preference towards degradable products, which is, you might think that cost is the only criteria, but because discreteness is very important and rural areas do not have the classic, hey, I throw my waste, it disappears, then suddenly it's much more visible in their waste stream and there is no centralized services for waste disposal. That actually leads to people using cloth because you can wash the cloth discreetly, dry it discreetly, and nobody would know. And that ties in very deeply in terms of thinking about why, and because of course the products like this that are disposable or truly degradable don't actually exist in the market per se. They don't have the kind of cost that is needed. And so when you're thinking about Peru, of course, the demand and supply becomes very valuable, just understanding these basic sets of numbers you could get. But from a calculation perspective, it would be much more valuable in asking things that from that basic data that you would have to derive. I think cost is a very interesting things to calculate and think about in comparing with other disposable products. What is the cost? The cost metric, at least what we have learned, again, from those Gates Foundation surveys and the TPP, which is the target product profile, is that no matter what, cost is a very significant barrier in terms of thinking about, because people don't have just disposable income, so that adds to this. So although we want more and more functionality, it cannot come at a higher cost than what's currently available. And so when you think about a rag of a piece of cloth, that has very little cost, because the challenge there is that running water is a big issue. And that's really why, and of course, because running water is an issue, health becomes, because then it's not hygienic for many of these places. So I think, but you should think a little bit through, you can read a little bit about it, but the whole goal of this exercise is you should define the types of questions, you should define the numbers that would be useful. And not all numbers should be just derivable from just looking at data. The goal is, I have this intuition, even if that number might be accessible, let me do the calculation to see what percentages I'll arrive at, and are they ballpark to the data that's actually accessible. So this exercise is not just, let me look up some numbers. You should really be thinking also about what numbers might not be accessible to you. Anybody else wants to mention any calculation that you've been doing? Anybody online? We're just discussing the first assignment, which is by the numbers. Does anybody wants to bring up and mention any calculation that you guys might be doing? Or even if you have chosen the problem per se, because that would be valuable to just see. Yes.
So some of the numbers just aren't available or totally hypothetical.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly okay if you start with some hypothetical numbers. If your question is important enough and you can't find the numbers, you do have to build a rigorous assumption framework. And those assumptions, as long as those assumptions are valid or just clear, then you can go back and change. This is also a little bit about inspiring other people to then go collect that data too. Because of course, I agree with you that things will change dramatically if your assumptions were not right. But that is embedded and explicitly stated in your calculation. Like when I think about Peru, for example, you might not know what disposable income for families in rural areas might be. Then you just make that up as a starting point, but that's a parameter in the problem that you'll be able to fix later. Or for that matter, if you want to figure out the context of recycling, you might not know the percentage of areas, but just make that explicit so that this is a fundamental number that you would like somebody to collect as well. I think this is much more about building a framework to make sure that the problem that you might start thinking about is actually a real problem, and you know who to call and ask explicitly, or have more number of people research that. And I think not shying away from that would actually be very valuable. The more number of assumptions you make will give you an idea around why those assumptions are so important. Like if you make an assumption and your numbers are so sensitive to that assumption, then you should also doubt that data and go back and double check or triple check that, because suddenly the market that you're trying to build for changes so dramatically. You might be thinking about making something out of Coke bottles. We were talking about thermal materials, and then just understanding how many total Coke bottles are accessible. And instead, if the object that you were building with was something else and your supply completely dwindles, something that you thought was accessible for free is not accessible for free, then it completely changes your design criteria early on. Anybody else wants to mention numbers that they might be doing? Yeah. Yeah.
Existing solutions that were there,
Mm-hmm.
and then I calculated mostly for last week I was studying polio. Most of the people have like this caliper thing.
So let's wait for that on the project discussion, because that's what we were going to start. Just in a second, because I think it would be valuable today to now transition for how to choose teams, how to make specific projects. I think there is a whole bunch of things that I'll list if people are excited. We'll go through some of the old projects as well. And then let's dive into, I think today I decided not to schedule a whole bunch of things. I think there is a little bit of a thing that we could do depending on 2D and 3D CAD, depending on people, how much experience you've had. But majority of the time will really be making sure that are we moving towards making some teams around projects as well. So we'll just come back to it. So unless anybody else has anything to say on the by the numbers, I think seems like many of you have not started, or go ahead.
Yeah, so my question was, I started with how many babies die each year from gestational STIs.
Okay.
And so like ones that are transmitted acquired at birth, like in the birth canal, rather than something like through the blood, like HIV. And I realized, first of all, that I needed to get specific to one area, and then I needed to get specific to one STI, or it was like impossible because there's so much variation. And even with that, there were so many unanswered questions. Like if there's like basically no diagnostics happening in early stages of pregnancy, and like a lot of those pregnancies result in miscarriages, then like you can't even quantify the number of like pregnancy losses and stillbirths, and then like neonatal deaths from like even one disease like syphilis, for example. So I basically was left with a bunch of unanswered questions, but new things to consider. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I think this is exactly why I want you to do it, is because this is that fine balance between knowing and not knowing, and getting an intuition that a good question will lead to many more good questions. And it is going to be messy. The sets of examples we were covering and what others people have done is a very clear-cut case. But this is the reality of the projects that you might all initiate and start. So I think I'm very glad that you mentioned this, and you're exactly on the right track, because what that means is that the way that you form your questions will really matter, and the way you even ask that question will matter. And I think there is a sense of, for many of you who might be coming from very quantitative fields, there is a sense of being comfortable with uncertainty to a certain extent. And on the other way around, many of you who might be coming from social sciences to feel that there is value in these numbers to begin with as well. I think let's dive in a little bit more, because it seems like this might be an idea that you might be excited about as a project. So on the STI context itself, I think, what are the class of assumptions that you can make? One suggestion that I would make is don't do this for global populations. Do it for a local context. So we have a collaborator in Kenya right now, and Grace from the lab is in Kenya, explicitly asking a question around STI diagnostics. So she's returning in a week's time, and you'll be able to talk very directly to her of what we learned so far, both in the breadth of challenges that are associated with STI diagnostics. I think just to give you how important this question is, in COVID, I don't know if you remember, Anton, the number of pregnancies in young girls increased by, what was the number? I'm trying to remember. I don't want to misquote it, but it's a very important number. 20, yeah, that's the number, that 20 to 25%. And that is because of abuse and other violence and other sets of reasons. So these are pregnancies that are also just associated with sexual violence, for example. And I mean, that's a shocking number. Then until Supriya mentioned it, it was, I mean, we think about COVID and we think about, and the connection there was actually, it's because of lack of income. So many of these pregnancies are also dependent on this in the context of, associated with income sources. And so that's one side of the story in which COVID, I think another number which was fascinating that Anasta dug up and calculated, you could try calculating what percentage of people every day get infected with STIs. And when I looked at that global number, it changed my opinions and views of even thinking about STI. So in the whole population, you can just see how prevalent that is. You say X percentage of population is sexually active, and that number at least was around 1 million people get infected with STIs every day. Every day. And it sort of changed my view of how to think about STIs when I read that number. And so sometimes you will get the number that you're looking for. Sometimes you'll find these numbers that are around, but it will solidify or either get you excited about working in that space, or it will say like, yeah, it's interesting, but maybe it's not as large a problem that I had thought. And again, it's not just about finding the largest sets of problems, but it's about hidden variables. And many of these hidden variables are not so obvious. The other part on this front would really be is that there is an incredible amount of work currently happening in trying to understand that when miscarriages happen, for example, or premature births happen, how are they connected to the health status and health state? And I could see that that is a very hard space because we do not have a diagnostic test that can predict whether somebody will have a preterm birth. So there's very little data associated with how to, even correlations with different disease status. Also, STI currently the cost, and the reason you're going to find it very hard, is in Kenya, the cost of diagnosis for an STI is almost impossible. So only research studies pay for it because many of them only are PCR detectable. And the thing that Grace is working on right now in Kenya is we're looking at what can microscopy do for the table. There are many sets of diseases that can actually be detected, and especially she's working on bacterial vaginosis, for example. In BV, there is a microscopy-based assay, but the reason you don't find much of the data is people don't go around and say, hey, something is not right, let me get a diagnosis. That doesn't happen in STI, and the only people that are diagnosed are through these large research studies, and that's how we know some of the numbers. But you could choose any of those research studies. I would say if you're focusing on this, focus on Kenya. We have some partners on STI. And the thread that would be valuable is if there is any US data that is much better correlation, because of course child mortality is evaluated much better. You could use some assumptions from another market or place like US and just say, assume if it's same scenario, I could actually use that same number for Kenya.
I was actually going to ask about that because I had a statistic from the US about morbidity and mortality in babies born with syphilis.
Yeah.
But like, how can you apply that to a setting where babies are born in a much different healthcare setting?
Yeah. I think it's about getting a ballpark first. So you could say that that is the worst case estimate or the best case estimate, sorry, right? Because no matter, there is better healthcare associated. And I think even in the US, those numbers are not great actually. And so you could say that my estimate will only get worse, but it's still valuable. Because, and I think as long as you're, the purpose of this is not a blinded number. This is why it's a page that you're writing, not just the final number. Yeah, I think this is something that will happen. Yeah.
There's a nice example as a patient design class where they're trying to design something that was supposed to fit around like the mouth of a patient. But it was in a particular social context where, you know, one demographic has like a larger facial feature than another, but all the data was from like the West. And then they were able to sort of, you know, improve that estimate by finding somebody that had done like how people develop in the context that they're interested in and sort of adjust, like merge those two data sets to produce something that was actually on point and delivered a useful like prototype.
Yeah, and remember this is in the context of COVID, right? Or
I don't remember. This is at a D school like crash course that I took.
I see.
It was one of their examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be very valuable to not shy away from any resources that you have. I mean, this is a fantastic question in space. And let's pick that up on the idea side. I'm very excited about the space because of now finally Grace having visited and also finding a really phenomenal partner in Kenya. So that would be a fantastic project space. Anybody else wants to comment on a question? Because I think that by the numbers has a link between problems that you might be interested in. So I'm trying for you guys to feel comfortable in this space, discussing the problems that you're passionate about. Because what I'm worried about is it's easy for me and many folks from the community to post a whole bunch of challenges. And then the best part scenario of the project is when you work on something that you are most passionate about, and we will then find resources for that and connection points and contacts for that, rather than the other way around. It's a much easier route and you might be able to engage, but you won't be at that front row seat, because you know you still have a lot to navigate in that question space. So it is quite valuable, and it's worthwhile thinking about those. Even if you don't choose to work on that as a project, it's still valuable to do this, because after this class, the goal really is that some of you think, oh, this was an interesting thing. I really do want to dive into that question. So anybody else wants to mention? Otherwise, we're going to jump into the idea discussion. Yes.
I didn't really finish the back of the envelope calculations, but the question right now is like the homeless in the Bay Area and their access to like vaccine programs or what vaccines like meals.
Mhm.
and how different cities. So it's more of a comparative, different how different cities like negotiation programs, like I think some are more successful. So I was kind of wondering how like which locations matter most in different cities.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And then you're thinking about it very granularly in the sense that if you were to start a needle distribution, where should it be physically located? Yeah.
So it's like it's on, and then in terms of assumptions, it's operating under the assumption that a needle distribution program would be helpful to mitigating.
Yeah. Yeah, but there is data on that.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, and I think San Francisco, there is somebody at UCSF that primarily works in that space.
Yeah.
So I like this one because you have to account for space, which is much harder to account in calculations. It's much easier to lump all your calculation, like country specific, but questions in which spatial patterns matter become very useful. And it's not so different from, when you're trying to establish train stations in New York City, where should you have a train station? And then that space context matters in distribution of people going back and forth. There's also a little bit of this on this being a moving problem, because I know if you think about police and how they police space, they try to clean up certain areas and that congratulates people in different areas. So you might see that this is a behavior pattern, and it also has changed over the years as properties change.
It's actually really interesting with COVID as well. This desire to keep certain spaces like free of people has led to a lot of what inequities kind of like.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It's like an excuse, right, to like push them out of like public spaces where they.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is plenty of data on this, and if you want, on vaccination side, there is data that you could look at where the vaccine clinics were formed for during COVID for homeless communities, and see whether that had the kind of impact it did in terms of numbers. I think this would be a fantastic by the numbers thing to do. The importance of this is, don't think of this as a daunting exercise. This is like, just say, hey, I'm going to carve out an hour from now and just scribble numbers and find whatever I can find. The goal is not rigor first. The rigor comes later. Like, you shouldn't be afraid of being completely off base and wrong, as long as you're not an order of magnitude wrong. It's just what ideas come through your head when you're thinking about those questions. That's much more important. There is no right or wrong in your assumptions, right or wrong in the numbers. But what's important is what else you need to think about when you're thinking about that problem.
And I think for me, one thing that always helps when I do these kinds of problems is like, if I hit a number, I think for me, I feel very like, I kind of have the same feeling that like, if I see a number or there's a number that I don't know and I can't find, and I have like really no good idea at all, I almost make this a smaller for me problem of like, how can I guess, within an order of magnitude of this number, and you guess the upper bound and you guess the lower bound, maybe from some simple calculation, and then calculate your final number with both of those two bounds. And that will, I think, at least give you a little bit more like ability to keep stepping forward when you hit these numbers that you really can't know.
Yeah, there is a very classical tool on geometric means and arithmetic means. When you ask just a random group of people, I don't know how many of you have seen that TED talk about predicting the weight of a bull, where this person brings a giant bull on stage and asks people to write down the weight that people think. And then he does this, I'm trying to remember whether it's arithmetic or geometric mean, and that was literally a pound or so away from this massive bull's weight. And so there are techniques out there of guessing and just also crowdsourcing certain types of numbers too. I think it only works for certain things where people do have some perception where you're not completely off base. Okay, yeah, so I think let's start with the idea discussions today, and especially on projects. I don't know how many of you have actually seen videos from the last year's class projects. So one thing that we can do is I think we probably won't spend too much time on this, but I just want to show you all that if you go here on the class 2019, there is roughly around 30 projects, and they're as varied as you might imagine. I'll say a word or two, and I'll kind of mention why these projects very specifically not being biased, you should all watch. There are 10 minutes talks on each one of these. But maybe I'll say a word or two about these projects to give you a sense of why it's a good project to be thinking about. Of course, there is no judgment on projects. We're not trying to evaluate your projects based on what you achieve in this short period of time. But it is much more about diversifying the kinds of problems that we all tackle, because sometimes what's in the news kind of occupies us, but the reality of what's happening on the ground is very different. And so one aspect of this is lived experiences are very important in terms of thinking about class projects or projects that you might be passionate about, because you have a much more deeper understanding of that problem. So the one problem that I'll just briefly talk about, and then we will.
Where this is on Discord or something?
So this is the Frugal Science like website. Sorry. So there's one more thing, which is this is linked from the Notion, but if you just go to frugalscience.org, that's where everything is.
Yeah, up there you can click on projects 2019. So if you go here, projects right here, and then there are 10 minutes videos on all of these. So these are links. So if you were to click on it, this one is not there, but
I think their video did not get uploaded.
yeah. But when you click on it, every one of this will lead to just some description. It's fun to just see the diversity, and maybe I'll just mention 2 or 3 of them that are just right here. I want to talk about Team Mica, just in a fascinating context that what's hidden to us doesn't rise, and you don't understand then what might be happening on the ground. And so the problem that Team Mica had brought last time, and again, this was rooted in 2 students that very specifically live in an area where mica mining is done. And
What is mica mining?
huh?
What is mica mining?
Oh, mica is basically a mineral that's actually, it has the credit for the world's flattest material. You can get mica to make atomically flat surfaces, but mica is used in a massive amount of industries for remarkable properties that it has. It has incredible thermal properties, so it's used in the electronics industry. And I'm sure all of you have seen it. It's this very shiny silver-ish sheet. It shimmers dramatically. So it's just, if I just do mica, you will see this. It kind of looks like these flakes. So that's one. Some electronics is put on it. There are many functions, but this was kind of the reality of the mica mining side of the story. The project that was brought about was thinking in terms of, India has very strict, or at least over the years, tried to build very strict labor laws around child labor. That was a very common practice that has shrunk now, but hasn't vanished. And this is one industry in which kids are still used extensively. And one of the things about the process of just trying to understand was that mica is a very laborious process, and there is a sorting step involved. And so the team really thought about was from an engineering perspective, the question was, could there be simpler sorting machines that you could build for separating mica from rubble, which is how you get it, and then using that to see whether social change can occur in terms of reducing populations and cohorts, which do include children. Now, the challenge of that, which is why I'm picking up this project, that if it was just a technical project, that would be one thing, but the team that came on was extremely sensitive around the idea that many of the people involved do not have any other sources of income. And so when you're thinking about a technological solution to this, are you actually eliminating them because these lands are not owned by them? And of course, there are, there's human trafficking sides of things associated with it. There's many other complexities, and who owns the sets of technology, and what does that do to people's incomes? How does that change? I think currently the funds that the students or the families get is very limited. So I think this is I'll share this deck. I think there might have been some sensitivities around why we might have decided not to upload it. But if people are interested, and if there was an issue here around, it's not just a technological solution. And if we do build a technology and it is in the hands of people who can afford it, that leads to displacement of given sets of communities from livelihoods. And what does that actually mean? Yeah. That's correct. That was the goal, is if you're given a giant pile of rubble, could you build something that separates mica? Right now it's done by hand. People break the stones and you touch and feel and you find flakes of mica that you pick up and you put it in another bin. So, I mean, it's a massive challenge in terms of all of world's mica, at least that's mine. India has a big mica production. And it's also located and it's, I think there are many layers to it that are social rather than technological itself. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's really interesting. When I read the description of like the person on my mind, she was like policy, and as you mentioned, labor policy.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to like see it from like a socio-technological perspective.
Yeah.
Like using technology to replace like the store.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Yeah, and I think also be worried. Also be worried that you might introduce a technological solution that might also introduce more inequalities because suddenly a source of income has. So it's not so trivial as well. And I think again, none of these projects are being judged. The goal really is not that within a quarter's time you have something that completely changes, but being sensitive to many of these ideas early on will allow you to see whether am I solving the right problem or not. And I think that's really the key goal of this class, is to make sure that you choose something and you realize the messiness of what you're about to begin and start, and what approaches, like, should technologies and tools like this be open source? What does that actually mean? Who is the owner of technology when you're bringing it? And again, as technologists, you might have an incredible power in implementing policy, or the other way around, that a policy person might have incredible power in building, pushing people to develop a technology because of the change of policy. Suddenly, if this really was enforced, the folks that are demanding MICA will have no choice but to invest in technology development. But then it might miss this third layer, that what happens to people that get displaced. Another kind of a project to think about. This was an interesting one, Space Junkies, because I just want to give an example of, not just think about terrestrial problems, but what I loved about this project was thinking about how do you remove debris from space, and also how do you think about cost of removal of space junk. So space debris are everywhere, every new launch and satellites that happens. I had a fortune of talking to an astronaut at ISS, the International Space Station. And what he told me, which I had never known, is every so often there is an alarm in ISS that rings, and then that means they all have to stop whatever they're doing. They rush and they have to huddle in a very specific location in the ISS, because the radars have detected a fast moving space debris that might be a size of a screw, literally a screw, that's hurling towards them at astronomical speeds. And if it hits just the right thing, the entire station might explode, or it may not know. They have no idea. So kind of like these raids that happen from the sky, you suddenly huddle in and then you come out again. There is no current technologies that can, I think even in terms of recording, now our capacity is getting better and better at mapping space debris, but the size limit is still, the damage that any tiny piece causes is much higher. And this is also why satellite costs are high, because you assume that they will get hit by something. And so what the team started thinking about is just, how do you even think about cost And lots of people are willing to launch a ton of satellites because right now it's not regulated. There is no cost for creating more junk in space, but there is a tremendous amount of cost in removing it because we haven't, the market has not matured. And now at this point, it is getting harder and harder. So many a times when these micro and nano satellites that are coming out, there are lots of people who are against that. Actually, astronomers are already seeing this, that much of this debris and junk actually is leading for them that they cannot see through deep space. They really have to go out of some of these orbits because many pixels are blank now because of these. And the thread that the team started thinking about is, how do you even do experiments in this space? Because just the idea of having an object that might be coming at 100 kilometers an hour, like, so they looked into what are the types of places. There are very few places that use these shock tubes that I remember a couple of days ago we were looking at. Stanford happens to have a shock tube in which you can make a projectile traveling at an incredible speed in trying to understand the types of materials. And I'm just giving this as an example just to make sure that, of course, you will think about terrestrial problems, but it's perfectly okay in the context of frugal science that you cast your, as long as the problem is interesting and important, it does fall into the bin. Eventually, they ended up exploring materials, especially non-Newtonian materials, that can dramatically dampen something that travels. Also, a little bit of a thread that we thought quite a lot about was around origami and exploring how multi-layer sheets can essentially slow things down, especially when these sheets are made out of these types of polymeric materials. And of course, the thread here is that there's a class of calculations you can do, but then there is also the class of experiments that you have to think about in this space because it's quite an experimental space as well. Currently, I don't know of any scalable method that's out there that can truly trap and clean space junk. So I think there are certain initiatives that NASA, and there are a couple of competitions around the space, but it's really early in the phase of what we have as tools. And I think maybe I'll just mention one more and then we'll transition. Another one that I'm a little biased towards is kind of this intersection of ecology and technology, and how this is Subhir and team, and then they're also still quite engaged. After a year of the class and COVID, they finally released, I don't know if some of you have seen their latest video. So this team is ongoing. They just released their first version of a complete product that was first built in the class. And I think this is Nish, Anesta's husband is also involved. The idea was, how do you detect elephants intruding and coming over in agricultural communities? Because the way it works is there's a huge amount of conflict that does exist and will continue to exist between populations of large mammals and agricultural lands. So it's very common in India, anybody who's been in South India, that farmers will wake up to find their entire crop devastated completely because a whole bunch of elephants. And then the view is that, oh, these rowdy elephants come and destroy your crops. And so some of that leads to people attacking elephants, elephants being killed or trapped. It's a very common thing. People will start digging ditches to trap elephants. And ironically, it's bad on both sides. Humans have been killed in the past, but also it leads to a negative sentiment towards elephants. And ironically, we are the ones that are intruding in their territories. So the idea was, it's from a very basic scientific insight that elephants can talk to each other via stomping. So I don't know if some of you have read the original paper. There was a Nature paper on this. I'm forgetting the mile range, but I think it's in the order of tens of miles, which is crazy to think about, that they literally just stomp and then other elephants are listening to it. And so the notion was, what is the most sensitive, how far can you detect when an elephant is walking by or when a herd is walking by? And so what they built, and again, going back to kind of an idea that Bene and I had mentioned early on, is exploiting hardware. They took an optical mouse, which you can see a little picture of, and they built kind of an earthquake detector or a bioacoustics detector based on that. So literally the technology is $2, but then they came up with a very, very clever optical lever, which you should look at, which is how do you amplify that signal to be very high sensitivity, which is related to the discussions we had in the past about if you have an optical system and it is sensitive to vibrations, how would you amplify it to detect? And so, I think there's been a series of things. There's a really beautiful prototype that they built. I think, again, going back to this notion of start with your problem, and then they explored many different solutions until they kind of jumped on this one. And then now it is a really interesting thing to also just think about earthquake predictions as a tool in seismology, other ways where you might want to actually record vibrations. You could think about this in the context of testing of structures, kind of if you're trying to test whether bridges and other objects are actually compliant to standards. But again, I think the thread there is also kind of a team in which there was an electronics person and somebody who really deeply cared about ecology. And so this is another important reason for why making sure that people from different sets of backgrounds might come and choose projects. So take a look at all of these. I think this would be a fantastic time for all of you to look through this because it'll give you some sense, and then you can also talk to if somebody gets excited about a project and wants to also continue in that space itself, or this is very similar to what you might be thinking about, which I would doubt, but still it's useful. You can also connect with the teams that are online on Discord, because many of the teams are connected at this point, right? Many of them came online. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about past projects. Yes.
I have a question. Can you share some of your thoughts or comments about projects on the intersection of art, science, and technology? Not necessarily.
Yeah, on the art front, maybe one thing that I would mention, one of my favorite, I mean, all of these are my favorite, but the one that I would mention is the Frugal learning tools for the visually impaired. And one of the fascinating things that they asked as a question is why as a society have we thought that just Braille is good enough? Reading is not the only way we incorporate information. And specifically in science education, they started looking at the role of graphics and paintings and art and how impacted we are in when we communicate science with that way. And that really led to how do you use artistic representations of science, but for the visually impaired? And they did a whole bunch of work in acoustics as one space of, how do you share a graph with someone versus how do you share a SEM picture or a photograph or a micrograph? The thread was, I think, much more broadly, and I think they did a lot of interviews in a couple of blind schools as well to really appreciate and understand how large a gap exists currently. So with computers, for example, there are incredible tools of accessibility at this moment that many people who are visually impaired might really think of having a career in computer science as a programmer, as a developer, because we have worked very hard on those tools being accessible. But there are certain classes of things when you really think about deeply engaging in the process of science, there's a huge barrier because all you can do is read and write, but that's only a portion of the tools, and especially in being able to understand data in a manner that's graphically represented. So I think that was one that had a kind of an artistic bend to it from the types of ideas that they came up with. Another one in that space would actually be, I'm trying to remember now, I think a couple of people utilized when they were thinking about, I think, maybe also in the context of frugal backpacks and there were a couple of artists in Pussy Riot. I'll actually mention this one because this was a really fascinating project from the context of this idea again that when you start a project, we are reinventing certain classes of technologies. So it was really about being able to detect pregnancy tests. So, we take it for granted. You say, oh, pregnancy test now. That is really a great example of frugal science. Everybody in the world has access to it. And what a wonderful thing. And with the team, this was a team from Mexico, at least, and then a couple other people, but the two sisters that started it, one of the examples around this was the kind of stigma associated with having access and thinking a little bit about the history of this field per se as well, because it's not so trivial to just walk into a pharmacy and ask for a pregnancy test. And that led to both in terms of thinking about, I don't know how many of you have read the original pregnancy test or where it came from or the biology of it. The original, first of all, pregnancy tests were illegal, and the only sets of technologies that we had was someone realized that if you take urine from a person that's pregnant and you put it on a frog skin, if the frog ovulates within a certain period of time, that means you're pregnant. That is the origin, actually. And literally, that's how we discovered the biomarkers of all these hormones associated with it, which is what led to the pregnancy test. But of course, we didn't have that as a technology. So at a certain point of time, there were underground labs in which you could buy Xenopus frogs live that would be shipped around, and you would literally have a live frog arrive, and this would be how you would do a pregnancy test. And actually what was really fun is that they explored that now, what does the current version of that look like? What is this underground network of building a pregnancy test that you can make from common parts you can find around you? Which flipped this question of just saying, okay, I want to, because again, from a sensitivity of this issue, is there a type of a test that doesn't have to be as reliable, but that gives people this kind of a direction or that cue? And again, of course, they explored many different social issues around this too. But the historic context is also important. Is, frogs are self-replicating technology, although not advocating that they're the right answer, but the power of that was they were self-replicating. There is nothing that you needed to do other than having a frog. Yes, there was a question.
Yeah, like what is the insight now that allows you to
Say that again.
what's the like the insight that now allows the pregnancy test to like be made at home
Oh, currently the reason that they are cheap is we just understood and realized the hormones associated. At that time when it came about, we didn't even know many of these sets of compounds that are present in urine. But that assay was the first one, and then people went one at a time to be able to then process it. So that test was very important, because in biology, there are these certain sets of assays, and that was the key assay. And of course, once you've identified the molecule, then you can detect it. And now we have very nice framework for sets of technologies of going from a compound that you're interested in, and you want to detect it in a lateral flow assay test, which we will cover in 2 classes from now. We will cover diagnostic tests in general. So we'll talk a lot about lateral flow assay tests. But there's not one insight. The other part of that is social acceptance around this issue. The reason much of that was underground at that time was some of the religious leaders were against this idea of having an access very broadly around pregnancy tests. So I think there's a lot of social issues around it. But yeah, I think, again, going back to this notion of, you might think of a problem is solved. And I think menstrual pads would be something that people would say. It's like, oh, we have the technology. We can really make 10-cent pads around the world. But then you look at the numbers and say, okay, why is it that people are not using it? There must be something about it. So this is another reason why it's so much more interesting to find the nuance in your problem early on, because you might be working on something and then realized that, it's not really, the problem is not as straightforward. So it's not just about having access. It's, I think in both of those sets of problems, discreteness is an important aspect to it, just practically speaking.
I'm curious if you know a little bit more on the context of why people were interested in putting urine on frogs in the first place.
Oh, this is how scientists think. I mean, this is, why would you not? These are screening. People have put lots of compounds on frogs before. Previously, the history of this goes back to, I mean, all our toxicology, for example, even before we knew what toxins, like, I think the biggest one is like BPA, or this PCB has a set of compounds that are released in our lakes. All of those toxicology reports were done on putting these compounds on live organisms, including frogs. I think frogs have been very interesting because they have also been used as mutant markers. So like finding frogs that have extra limbs and other things have been used in the past as carcinogens, for example. There are certain sets of threads that single cells, Daphnia is another example of a multicellular organism that's been used in toxicology. I think there was a very specific experiment. I'm trying to figure out who that person is. There was a women's rights person that really championed this, and this group was running an underground frog facility. And that actually also led for these frogs to be very commonly used as a research organism as well. So I think it's, yeah, there's a lot historic. Yeah, it's a really fun, you should all dig into these types of stories if you want to have a bit better appreciation of frugal science. I think one comment I want to make related to this is thinking about making solutions that have self-replicating materials as part of your solution. So if you can eliminate supply chains, I think for diagnostics, we are explicitly thinking about now for one product that we are making, which is driven by the bacteria. Bene, you're going to be in the lab, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll see you at the 4:30 thing. Yes. And then we can sit down tonight. I'm here pretty late. Yeah. I think that's another thing that I don't feel has been utilized as much. So many projects are dependent on supply chains. And if you can actually come up with where your reagents are all free because it's built on a bacteria, and then once that strain has propagated, it's available to everybody. I think it's very doable now, and especially because lyophilization and other sets of techniques have become valuable. There are lots of organisms that you can actually freeze dry, but supply chain has been a huge issue in terms of thinking about who is allowed to manufacture a piece of technology. And this is how many entities control their usage, where the technology is very simple, but they are controlling the materials or the chemicals that go inside. So although you can replicate, you can reverse engineer many things, some of those aspects are much harder to reverse engineer. So on the diagnostic side, if people are interested, as a lab, we are thinking extensively about this self-replicating assays where just it's bacteria that you grow and the bacteria is the reagent, and they are overexpressing everything that you might need. And I think there's a couple of papers that are out now demonstrating this for specific assays as well.
Yeah, I think just as a quick side note, that that's just really, I feel like when we talk like frugal science, I know it's like I think the default assumption going in is like let's just like do stuff either like solve problems for a low income context or like do things cheaply. But it's, I think frugal, I think we try to encompass more of like not just like solving problems for low income situations, but like can you do science frugally and locally, like in any environment, I think is the idea. So like Manu said, of like self-replicating, like information is self-replicating, but like oftentimes the stuff that we're trying to say, you know, like we're in this research lab, right? This is like a very, very like one point spot on the earth where you can do all of the science that is known to humankind. But I think the goal of frugal science would be that this science now can be done in anyone's context, in anyone's like location, using materials that are locally available. So I think that's like right now is almost the biggest barrier. It's like information can get distributed, but it's not helpful at all if we say, hey, you know, go and buy this like Zeiss microscope and then look at your local E. coli. Like there's no way you can do that if you're building things very locally. I think.
Yeah, I think another way of saying this is also just we have to solve all these problems in the context and locations that they exist. So you can perfectly okay to choose a problem that is completely solved here and then just really think about that problem in another location where that same solution just does not apply because of, and again, I think the reason I chose that pregnancy test example was because of that, because I had always assumed it's a solved problem. And I actually used to give that as a great example of the progress of technology until I heard back the level of stigma in especially teens and younger groups to be able to have access to such a credit. I mean, of course, in the US, you're all seeing what's unfolding in the US right now on the rights around this as well. So it becomes very complex very early on. And that information is just not accessible to everyone. Okay, so we're going to take a break and transition to the idea sheets. Unless anybody has any questions on past projects and the logistics, maybe I'll just describe a little bit of the logistics of what I would like for us as a class to do now. I think this is the week that would be valuable to start committing to projects. On the logistics, there is the Notion sheet. There is a giant table. We also probably also shared the last year's Notion sheet, right? There is a very big list of projects and ideas that you could look through. Anybody, it's a free for all. The notion is you should come up with your own sets of things that you want to post in there. They're divided in the context of health education and I think what I would argue is most of the learning will really happen if we rapidly just choose projects now. What I was thinking of doing is, again, that's also how you can recruit people. So you can find a project that somebody's posted and you find it interesting, just write your name. Right now, you can write your name in multiple projects as well. So it's not as if there is just one thing that we have to think about. And actually, let's maybe just open and share. Can you just tell me where is the Notion page? So yeah, if you just dive in that. So I think that's the discussion that I want to start. I know already in the few sets of projects, what was your name again? So Shweta has already talked about polio. So I think I'm just going to make a few sets of a list of things and then have brief discussions as a group on projects and teams. Are there other people who want to spend maybe 5 minutes just describing an idea or something that you're passionate about, different projects? This would be your time to also pitch to other people in the class a project that you might want to recruit. I just want to make a quick list of people. Is this already the live?
This
board?
is the live one.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a lot of.
And I think as you can also see, lots of people who are taking the class online will also be kind of thinking about it. And again, this is open, and the nature of problems being open is very important. So nobody takes ownership. You can have multiple teams also working on the same project or a question itself. As long as you've all seen through these class of questions. But before we dive into it, I would want, just for the people who are physically here, are there areas or spaces that you've all been thinking about? I know you mentioned something.
Yeah, gestational STIs. And then actually Erica commented below me something else about STIs.
Uh-huh.
So maybe there's someone else besides me who is going to do that.
Yeah, and I think this is what you want to do now. And so when you find something like that, send a quick chat, mention, and you can start having calls with people as well so that you start converging around a class of ideas. Because I think what would be valuable, what I would love is, even though it might not be the perfect question, I would love for us as a class to just converge, that everybody feels passionate about at least one. You can have multiple things. You can even actually listen in on conversations on other teams, but at least one question that you feel like, okay, by the end of this quarter, this is what I'll be presenting. This is what I'm excited about. And from now onwards, the lab classes, we will set up something for you guys to see, but I also don't want it to just be a whole bunch of demos and the class is over. We have secured a little bit of financial resources. So I think we have roughly around $2,500 or so dollars. So this will cover our material costs and things. I'll just divide that up in teams. I'll also ship some of that money to the teams that are not physically here as well. But the value of these lab sessions will be in that sense that we really break down and start asking what are the sets of things and materials that you want to start playing with as well. So yes.
I'm a little bit confused about how practical these questions need to be.
Yeah. So early on, they don't have to be. They are just a hint towards a direction that you're excited about. And as you're building a team, you can converge on something specific. So this is much more of also a feeler for somebody else also being passionate about the same class of questions. If you already have a very clear idea, then it's great. The more sharp it is, the better it is. But this is also a little bit, it's a little more inclusive because this is what people will find. Like you already mentioned that you found Erica, and even if it was a vague question, we're also trying to do team building here. So both sets are perfectly okay. You might have actually also worked on that question. For example, you might have been thinking about something already for a long while and you have a depth in that space. And this would be, when you frame it, you should just frame it more general so more people can broadly get excited. This is a way to recruit as well. And it's also, this is just something that's useful. You might not work on it and then come back later and get an intuition for it. It's like, oh, this was interesting. I want to pick this up at a later stage. So in some sense, having more is actually useful.
And as far as like, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
As far as like roadmap goes, I think part of the reason that it's okay, like right now, it's very okay to be super broad, or not crazy broad, but you know, not completely honed in, because as the project develops, we'll go through stages, and then at the end, usually, I think what we did last year was at the end, the demo was like, okay, what is the minimum? If you, for example, if you have a very broad problem, that's very difficult to like come up with a solution for this problem, right? But like, what is the minimum viable like demonstration of tackling an aspect of this problem that would be worth and able to be able to pursue within the quarter's time? And then that's the one that you'll like dive in on. But the whole problem as a space, you need, like, we have teams explore all of the different questions in this space to figure out which one actually is the minimum viable demonstration, if that makes sense. So we can start broad and then zoom in and then really nail like one specific demonstration.
Yeah. It's also, you can think of a problem and then just take this first step in that direction. I think the goal here is to be really driven by problems and not by your skill set. That's the key. So just as long as you feel that that's a big problem, you deeply care about it, you don't have to know what is we're not there yet. You don't have to know how to crack it yet. And that's what we will spend the entire time. And even at the end of the quarter, if you feel like I'm really passionate about this problem, but I've thought about this in 5-10 different ways, and I don't still feel I've cracked it, that is a perfect place to be, because the goal is to approach that problem in as many ways as possible and be honest and true to the problems rather than, so I think we won't be, solutions is something that you can generate a massive amount of, but you have to anchor to the problem. Think of it as a step one that you might want to take. So just evaluating a problem well enough is also actually the step in the right direction. So even if it was hard to evaluate, if you were very rigorous about evaluating something, that is what everybody should do. Ironically, we very quickly jump to solutions and we start thinking as technologists, we just get really excited about that part. But if you can really rigorously spend time evaluating a problem, that's actually also viable. So I want to hear from people just so that I have an intuition for where we will land as a class. I know certain sets of groups get really passionate about kind of environmental issues. And I'm also going to choose the outside experts that I'll bring for the next coming lectures based on, so now since you mentioned STDs, I'm going to ask Supriya to come spend half an hour or an hour as a lecturer. She is an incredible individual. She's dedicated her life in working in Kenya and many settings like that around these issues, and especially the social issues that come with it. So polio, I'm still looking for a certain set of a person, but if there is an individual that you might know that we might want to hear from just to understand other contexts of polio that as a lab, as a group we might not have heard of. It's perfectly okay to suggest names that I can reach out to people if there is a particular person you would like to engage. We do have a very large network, and I want to tune these people that are coming in and talking to us very specifically for the problems that you might be excited about. So we could go around in terms of the questions that people might be interested in, or at least a sense of a space that you started gathering, but we could also start with people who already have a very specific question in mind. I know two people already. What was your name again?
Emily.
Emily. So Emily's already mentioned STDs, and then I'll also go through if there are certain sets of people online. Anybody else wants to talk about, we take this 5 minutes talking about a problem that you're excited about, that you started converging? Yeah.
Just thinking about homeless people, especially in rural areas and very flat environments, how do you provide proper shelter that's not going to overfeed them?
And then are you thinking of a specific country, specific, is there?
I guess like it could be very generalized. This came up in a conversation the other day where like one of my friends is like, this grandfather was building a house in Arizona, and he's like his neighbors, the family of 4 children, they're living in a shack, and like literally what they need most right now is a swimming pool during the summer so they're not overheating. And so like, I guess, is there another frugal option or approach to that?
And then I think I'm gonna bin it in the conversation around shelter and housing as a much more broader thing, because I think a couple of people have mentioned this as well, and it would be valuable. What was your name again?
Dolly.
How do you say that?
Dolly.
D-O-L-L-Y?
Yeah. Why?
Okay, so I think, yeah, let's have a brief discussion on that. Anybody else who's been thinking about stuff? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's fantastic, primarily because this is really what Grace is, and I and Nesta are working on currently in the lab as well, in what can and we cannot do. So this would be very much in line with already both the sets of resources that we built on the ground. And there's a very specific question in that space that we're asking as well. So that would be phenomenal. And I think I'm just going to write this in the context of women's health. And then, what was your name again? Katie. And then the other person was Aya?
Yes.
And then is Aya at Stanford? Or?
Yeah, she is. I think she's just.
I'm here. Yeah, I tested positive for COVID, so I'm joining virtually for the next 2 weeks, but I'm at Stanford.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And I think this will be the harsh reality of just as a lab. And I think, yeah, for projects, I think this becomes very valuable. I'm thinking about at least, if in terms of the mixed sets of teams, I'll send out certain sets of messages on the people on the international side, because by next week, the goal is to have, there is a lot of stuff here, but let's have, say, 5 or 10 key projects that actually have people behind it. And then you can also recruit a few people from the online community as well, because then they might bring a totally new color to it because they are physically located at a new place. They might bring a completely new skill to the table. So I think this convergence is very valuable. So the fact that the two of you are already talking is valuable. And up till now, I haven't given you all kind of a summary, but I heard from a few people on feedback, people wanting to know the projects that are already running in my lab, which we have lots of resources for. And then that would also be very valuable if this project completely aligns with what Grace is working on in Kenya right now. So when she comes and talks about this, this will become very valuable, because finally then there is, not just abstract, but there is physical momentum. There's a very clear path. And again, still, we can still come up with multiple different directions that we will choose for it, but there is a common base of cohort of people. And I think, but I don't want to bias you have to arrive at that question independently. So rather than, because there's a sense of, I want to make sure that we diversify the class of questions that we're excited about.
I want to say also vice versa. I know we said, getting people from the online community. Also, there's plenty of ideas here. If there's any that, as you guys are looking at the board, whether it's proposed by someone physically here or someone online that you're interested in jumping in, like this is fully everyone. Like
This is bi-directional by all means, and actually, it's just by the nature of the fact that there are more number of people online than offline. That will always be the case. I think you should just choose problems that you're passionate about. That's the only underlying criteria, and think deeply about this rather than So this is something that you are trying to explore widely, but then what you choose, at least for this quarter or for a long enough time, there's a sense of commitment that you're trying to make. Anybody else wants to mention problems, project spaces? Yeah.
I just had an idea whether or not it's gonna run or not.
Okay.
Something like.
Did you literally have an idea right now, or?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Fantastic. We're using this time productively. Yes.
I was thinking about like, kind of, I love surfing and like the different components associated with that, like the wax that we produce, like wax boards, like the material, like there's a lot of something like debate about whether like the wax that we use on the board releases chemicals that like are harmful to the environment. I was just thinking like, what if we made some sort of like sustainable ocean friendly wax?
Yeah, no, I mean, I see that's a fantastic question. Like just even how you're talking about it, I know in your head you're surfing right now, and that's how it should be. Like this is what I really mean to say that the questions that you think about there, and again, you would also know the community per se. You would also understand, and I mean, one thing that I can just also mention because I know a few people who have been using this as well is literally using surfboards as a ecologically monitoring system. So there is a class of things that you can attach under a surfboard that allows you to make certain sets of measurements. And while people are just surfing, they're also collecting data that might be environmentally viable and valuable. So I think, just that's a really fun platform because I can already see a community around it, which is also another thing. As you are thinking about projects, see who would be the first set of a community that you would want to engage with. So if you're thinking of diagnostics, your community might be a healthcare worker. When we're thinking about diagnostics and menstrual blood, there's a very subclass of a community that you can choose and think about that, oh, this would be the type of community that I would want to get feedback from. This would be the community that could be the first adopter of that tool or technology. So I'll kind of just write this in as chemical, ocean-friendly chemicals, chemical processing and surfboards. Have you made a surfboard before?
No, I haven't, but actually I will try to take like a Frugal class. I didn't think it's try and make it, but I will go around. So
But I think finding the materials, at least in this class, will be valuable to make a mini board to start testing. Yeah. What was your name again? Valeria. Yes. Sorry, I'm asking you guys specifically because I do want to learn those names, but hasn't happened yet. Anybody else wants to just pitch in things that they might be thinking about?
I think this might fall into things that we've already talked about, but I've been thinking about how a blind person could detect when they've started their period for a while.
Yeah.
And so, like, obviously, it should be discreet, which makes it more complex. And so then from there, I started thinking of like pH as a way to detect. But then it led me to the fact that like people in general use vaginal pH to monitor vaginal health at home. And that's pretty cheap because it's like a visual, like color changing thing. But that cheap thing is not accessible to blind people. So then it was just like in general monitoring vaginal health for blind people.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a fantastic convergence of 2 or 3 ideas, and also because of the plant pad project in the lab and the diagnostic project in the lab and a few other people now engaged, Grace and Supriya engaging, this would be phenomenal. And especially also being able to understand the perspective of a person who goes through this directly. I think I can see this as a broad set of technological suites and capabilities and expanding. I mean, I think that is fantastic. It's also something that it's not a very obvious unless you deeply think about it. So it's again in that space. And I think this is also why a good question is something where, when you hear about it, immediately dawns on you, oh, that's interesting. But it's not something that you would always read about in newspapers, or like what we hear as class of questions are just they're average questions, because that's what percolates into the top. And I think there's a human side of it that I could really see in terms of design that would be very valuable, because then you can broaden that out and really just consider that as what are the personal health tools that we take for granted that someone who is blind does not have. I'm just writing that in the women's health kind of space as well. But and I think the purpose of these types of groups is now at least the three of you should just talk as well, set up it on a Discord, invite other people to say, oh, this is going to be a general Zoom call around women's health. Here are a few sets of ideas we're excited about. I'll ask Grace to connect from Kenya, and I'll ask Supriya to connect. And then you should just internally have those conversations as well of what are the common pools that would then lead to specific projects. Anybody else wants to kind of mention if there's things people are thinking about? Anybody online that you haven't had the chance, if there is a project that you're really excited about, it doesn't have to be something that you came up with, but it could also be something that's posted on the idea board, and you just feel like, oh my goodness, I could give an arm and a leg to work on a specific project. Don't give an arm and a leg, but figuratively speaking. Maybe I'll stop sharing in a second to just see. Anybody online wants to chime in on projects? Go ahead, Deborah.
I just want to pitch one from Brian von Hertzen of the Climate Foundation, who I talked to about this class. And he's working on arrays to say, seaweed, which so many people live on, and permaculture arrays that can go down into the deeper ocean and keep things cool. And he's stationed in the Philippines and Australia. So he said they're trying to figure out how to make them out of bamboo. And think materials that people in the communities could use, just basic fishing line and bamboo and other with like cranks so that you could lower them. And anyway, just an interesting idea.
Yeah, I think so. Deborah, I've spoken to him a couple of times, and what I will do is I'll ask him to connect also in one of the sessions as a mentor.
He would love to. He wants to. Yeah.
He was in my queue of people to invite this year. And one of the things is also just overall, there is a whole bunch of access to experts we have around seaweed. So if anybody is interested in food side of the story and the context of seaweed as food, as a sustainable, I think, from a context of farming perspective, there's a massive amount of growth there. And then, of course, the Climate Foundation thing that Deborah just mentioned is also very practically anchored in a given community. And so certain sets of things you would be working on, there would be direct partners who would want to scale something like that as well. So Deborah, if you just write a message to him, and then we'll see, have him join. I'll ping you on which class, but I think one that would be, one thing that I'll try doing is also just independent of some thematic classes, this would be a very valuable thread on also mentioning a couple other projects. I know one space or a challenge in this context is also infections in kelp. So kelp also get infected, and then the entire farm in kelp farming gets destroyed because of that. And of course, when we do terrestrial farming, you can see stuff, you can immediately visualize. When kelp is underwater, you don't until you go harvesting and you see that, oh, the entire set of a farm has been infected by certain sets of pathogens. So there's another space in terms of thinking about food and overlap between tools that we will need. Was there a comment, Emma, that you wanted to make?
No, I just a product idea.
Yeah, go ahead.
It also uses like about funding to buy like action kit to start going off what's up on there's a note on the nation.
So Emma, your voice somehow it's kind of
it's
ringing. I don't know if there is a way. Okay, now you went mute. But there was a second in which it was clearer. No, still mute. You want to type? We could hear you. It was as if it was echoing. Okay, try now. I could hear you typing. Okay, yeah, it's working now.
Yeah, you hear me now? Sorry, I was connected to a speaker. I got the funding that I applied for to buy a DNA extraction kit so I can start teaching young people about soil sampling and DNA sequencing. So I would like to work on a project to make that as accessible to as many children as I can. So a project that would sort of incorporate learning about microbial life.
Yeah. So Emma, a couple sets of comments. I think there are a couple of communities that we have supported in the past, also in the intersection of soil microbiome and broader education. So that's absolutely fantastic. I'll write on the both the ideas board, but also on the Discord as we start creating project channels itself. So for folks who are already set on a specific project, on Discord, you should create a specific channel for it for discussion.
And actually, to clarify, I think currently I'm the only one who has the ability to create channels.
No, so we should open that now for everybody in the class.
Yes, we will figure that out. I think for now, at least, if it's okay, shoot if you have a project that you're coalescing
or if you want a channel.
Yeah, if you want a channel, put it on the idea board, make sure it's on the idea board, and then shoot me a message or post in any of the Discord channels, and then we'll create you a channel with you and anyone else that you want on the team.
Yeah, I think the idea of these sets of channels is that you can have conversations that don't get lost. And some of those conversations are also viable because I might be screening through and I might see, oh, soil, and then suddenly the sets of conversations can begin, because otherwise in the broad channels, it just, once it goes above a certain point, it's lost. Yeah, so Emma, if just ping Tyler, create a soil microbiome channel, and I'll connect a couple of threads of also just the past work itself. And then it would actually also be valuable in terms of thinking about the sets of tools, both not just in terms of extraction and metagenomics, but also there are a couple of threads on microscopy. Yeah, so I think, that would be fabulous. And I think, again, for folks that are interested, the biological content of what is in a spoonful of soil is the most important marker in terms of thinking about the health of the soil. So there has been the last, I would say the last decade of science tells us that we've been measuring the wrong sets of things when we talk about productivity in soil. We have all kinds of tests that you can do to measure productivity that are much more inorganic. And what we really need to do is to measure the organic content. So I think this would be a really phenomenal. And then again, going back to carbon that's stored in our soil, this is another perspective associated with it. So I think there is a climate side to it too. Yeah, I'm very excited that you are gonna pick this up. This would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'm excited that I got funding, so I'm actually able to buy the equipment now. So it's great.
Yeah, that's good. Yes.
I had put something up, I can't find it on the idea board about
exactly that. About that? Right. Perfect. So I think that would be phenomenal. And then what was your name again? Susan. So Emma, Susan in the class also mentioned, so you guys should just connect.
Yeah, I think I've commented on our Notion. So
yeah, I think on the Notion side, if people write the comments and names, and that would give people, if you just use Discord IDs as a way to connect, that would be the easiest. Anybody else online wants to champion an idea that they're excited about? There's nothing in the chat, right? That we've
Yeah,
missed?
there is. There's
Oh.
one from Rishika.
Rishika, do you want to talk about it?
Or I could. Oh, go ahead.
Hi everyone. So I have a question like, can we make something like a smart biosensor or a chip that can detect the cancer or other rare diseases, like the early stage of cancer or the tumor in the human body? Is it possible to make? I have a question.
Yeah, so I think Emma, Rishika, the comment that I would make is identify a specific type of cancer that you might be excited in terms of thinking, or a very specific rare disease, because many of these sets of approaches are so specific. I mean, of course, you can never answer a question like this unless we try. And so I would kind of flip that around, is choose the need. And one big space just in the past and also this year, but many years ago, that we've been thinking about, and there's some amount of work that we have done in that space, is for oral cancer. And just oral cancer comes from, for many emerging countries, it's rising as one of the biggest cancer. India, the numbers are absolutely horrific, but it's also treatable if it's detected early. And so I think it's valuable to position this question to be as specific, just because this domain is so large. And then there might be certain sets of approaches. I'm just mentioning that oral cancer is a space that we have worked in the past, but you should just look through this and identify, cervical cancer is another one that goes undetected for a long period of time. There's a huge issue around the diagnostic sets of technologies, where the comment that you made. And then the other place, just as a background, if you want, you can also check, there is a diagnostics platform. I'll talk quite a lot about it in the diagnostics lecture in 1 or 2 days this coming week. And you can also just look through the SnapDX website. There's another sort of a molecular platform that we've been building that might be of value in this space. But the comment is, narrow down just a little more, so you have an approach that might be applicable to that specific disease, for example.
Okay.
And then
Thank you.
you want to just introduce yourself also, just so people know your background, just maybe a one-line intro.
Okay, I'm Rishika Basak. I'm from India. I'm right now an undergrad student at VIT University. I'm pursuing my major from like bioengineering, in the subject of bioengineering.
Yeah. Okay, anybody else wants to pitch in a project? Yes.
Designing about the application you have in engineering, just I have like areas that I really like, generally like waste valorization. So like the choice of the raw material, for example, pistachios. There's so many pistachios. What do you do with the pistachios?
Yeah, you're talking about the shell.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is connected to the biomaterials discussion you guys had this week. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Eggshells fall into that same category. Yeah.
So how do you decide one application for it? Is it going to depend on the properties of the material?
Yeah, so I think the way to pitch that question will be, it's perfectly okay to not always be purely problem driven. Or you could just argue is, oh, what do I do with this waste stream? And I think, banana falls in that same. A fascinating group of companies that I have seen that started recently have been flower products, because in India, a massive amount of flowers are used in temples, and then they are just thrown and they degrade. So the way that you would structure this would be is just to first understand the amount of waste that pistachio makes. And I think, I don't know, Anton, if you covered at all the material database for biomaterials a little bit.
Yeah, we did touch on that, and a couple examples of sort of similar spirit of like fish scales or walnut shells that came up.
Yeah. So I think that would be really valuable, and you are thinking of that from a resource point of view. Maybe another way of saying this is, it might appear right now that what we are doing as an exercise is very linear, like, oh, I choose a problem and then I think about its solution and I slowly break it down. And if I think hard enough, I will get to an answer. That is not the reality of how you will come up. And that's why you have to embrace this messiness, that you start thinking about it and give yourself the kind of flexibility, but also work from the other way around, which is to say, oh, I find this material so interesting, there must be something interesting here, and keep converging. And sometimes it doesn't have to happen in this time frame, but it can also happen more broadly. You are filing it in the back of your head, and for a specific, you can also do a tiny sub project where you just say, oh, I evaluated this in this framework, trying to look for a use of a tool like this. So it's a different way of posing problems, I think, but it's equally valuable. And the one idea that Anton and I have been working on and thinking about is putting together a website for designers that have biomaterials and their properties easily accessible. So as engineers, I can go online and I can find how does steel behave, or how does carbon steel behaves, or how does alumina, any material I want. When it comes to biomaterials, very little is known about how what these basic properties of what is so special about pistachio that you could actually use. And we have been thinking about this as a community project. So I think last year also we had a project that was just around building a database like this, which was a biomaterials database. And we could organize it just by abundance. Eggshells, I know there are a couple of things that people use for, but it would be valuable to just have a site like this. One reason I think about these database sites are so powerful, I don't know if any of you know this website called This to That. You guys don't know this? Anton is laughing. You know this, right? Yeah. So is it also called This to That, the URL? This to That. This to That is basically advice for gluing one thing to the other. And so, attach this to that, choose something and choose something, and then let's glue. And it tells me, but if you think about as designers, if I wanted biomaterials, I want properties, this is incredibly powerful when you have resources like this. And this is also why plastics are used so commonly, is because for plastics, all these properties are really readily available. So when you're making design decisions, so one of the big goals of this website is around, and so imagine on one side choosing a whole bunch of waste products, and on the other hand, having a ton of properties that show up. And then again, you don't have to do that explicitly, you just initiate and start, and community members can add to it. So I think, when you're thinking about these are mini projects that can be done, and it helps you understand in a manner that, and right now you're thinking about pistachios, but there might be even a broader group of materials that are wasted that we don't actually account for.
The other aspect of that is the locality of it, knowing where these things are, and kind of the right actual use case for.
Yeah, so knowing a map of bio-waste would actually be pretty cool. So you browse around a global map and you identify and you say, oh, in these sets of communities, these are the common bio-waste. I know, for example, Costa Rica, a big one is orange peels. And then I know someone who did something quite radical. The orange peel companies were paying a significant amount of money to get rid of it. And this individual used them as fertilizers to literally grow forests, because there's a massive deforestation problem. And so literally he was buying land from cattle farmers. This is Dan Zenzen, he's a very famous conservation biologist. And he had this aha moment. Everybody before that time had always thought that once you have lost a forest, you can never regrow primary forest. And he demonstrated by buying land from cattle farms. And again, his frugal science answer was, how do you then radically increase pollination and growth in the land that you've just bought to let wild forests grow? and he dumped a massive amount of orange peels. And what happened non-linearly in that was that orange peels, when they degrade, generate alcohol, and that smell attracted pollinators from incredibly far off places and insects. And so suddenly those grew rapidly, and then he demonstrated over a period of 10 years. I think 5 years he could get secondary forest. 10 years, nobody could tell the difference between that land that was regrown as a forest. So again, it was all orange peels. That was his primary solution. So I think it would be very valuable, just documenting these types of things as well.
Quick follow-up. So do you have like, any thoughts on the vice versa process? As in, like, I know that like, something is working. For example, like in an example, this is from my interest in the intersection of dance and science. So I know there is a lot of eye movements that goes in dance, and there are also like studies, yoga and stuff, like where they literally focus on eye movements and strengthening eye by like doing those exercises. But I don't see there are like scientific evidences for that. So what I'm thinking is, if I find like if we find something to prove it, this like gets a new channel to like find for applications. Because like last week I was talking to you like regarding this. When I was trying to study this, I just saw glaucoma as like a disease that is like basically caused by high pressure in the eyes. And just now I googled the statistics. It's like 80 million people around in the world who are like affected by glaucoma. And so like if these are inculcated like from their early years, and I know from like India, there are a lot of people who take dance classes or yoga, and not just restricted to the area. So like.
No, I think this is exactly what is so valuable, that you're embracing the nonlinear process. That it's not always, although in our head we want to be thinking about a problem, so that there is a sense of, but arriving at it backwards is incredibly valuable, and that's how the brain works. And especially exploiting the fact that there is a certain sense of an experience that you might have. This is why you would arrive at a new solution. Going back to eye movements, at this point, there are some very straightforward technologies now that could be used to measuring eye movement. They're used in neuroscience research as well. Literally, so much of the vision-based systems that do facial recognition are perfectly capable of tracking eyes. And so I think much of those technical tools would be there, and it's perfectly okay if the data doesn't exist, that then the goal would become is to connect those two threads and collect that kind of data. So I think I would highly encourage these types of explorations, because the downside of something like that not working is it's no big deal. But the upside of it is quite valuable, because you are approaching these questions with a type of a very creative mind of, there is something there. So I think for any sets of problems, as you're thinking about solutions, if you have a gut feeling, and again, falsifying ideas is very quickly, but you do want to start with a broad range of ideas. So if you're excited, create a glaucoma channel, see if anybody else is interested, set up a time for a chat, and then we would just do these brainstorming. So I think now we are in this phase where, as we're converging on projects, let's do brainstorming sessions together where collectively people feel like, okay, this is worth doing or trying. And you can invite other people in that conversation as well. And out of that comes out a very specific sets of things to try to do. I mean, some of that is literature search itself, but this is what's valuable is, I think maybe another way of saying this is having the confidence in your ideas is the biggest lesson to learn, because many important out-of-the-box ideas will really sound crazy the first time you think about it. So the fact that you raise them, you bring them out, and there is no judgment in any of our sets of approaches right now, because this is why we will come to the broadest group of ideas. So I think, yeah, it's fabulous that you're thinking about it, and it's not always that you think hard about a problem and then out comes a solution. It's many times it's the opposite. You have a nag for something, and you have a missing middle piece. You don't know what problem it can solve, and you don't even know that it can sail, but you have an intuition about it, which is what this is. It's perfectly okay to bridge that gap on both sides. I think it might have appeared so far, the way that we have been structuring this, that we're really starting with problems. I just want to emphasize that problems are still the most important thing, because solutions will come and go. You will be anchored around an idea that's on a problem. But on the other hand, how you solve them is not a linear process in any way. And this is why some of the classes are just purely dedicated to technical content, because I want you to have intuition about those sets of technical skills as well. Any other kind of project ideas? I think I'm realizing we might end early in maybe 15 minutes or so, but anybody else has any sets of threads that we didn't discuss in terms of ideas that you want to bring up? Yes.
Another one that I've been thinking about is developing more non-toxic biodegradable dyes.
Mm-hmm.
Or because the dye industry is
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, and I think, are you thinking of dyes in the context of clothing or, right? Yeah. I mean, I think that would be fabulous, because there's a lot of conversations around how unsustainable the overall fashion and clothing industry is, just in terms of also the amount of our usage and disposal of clothes per se, but then the chemistry that goes in. And the history, I'm just gonna write this down as a, this would also take it into a little more of the chemical domain itself, and having an index. When we buy a piece of cloth, I have no idea what chemicals have gone in or what chemicals it will release over time, and making people much more even aware. The history of this is also really fascinating. Like the very first red color, I don't know if people know already, how did we discover the color red? So it was a royal color because we used to kill insects, and there was a very particular insect that you had to squish to get all the red color. And the discovery of indigo and these blue colors, they all came through this massive competitions. Before that, they used to be the color of the kings and the queens because they were so difficult to make. Now we have gone the other way around. We have scaled this to a point that these dyes are literally extremely cheap. But yeah, I think this ties in well with what Valeria was also talking about in terms of assays. So I could see a commonality associated with this.
in terms of
You know, the assay that you might develop to detect whether this object is still leaching a class of chemicals, for example. Or you might want to think about a tool that people can determine the toxicity of their own clothing that you buy, so that there is a larger database that might be associated with it. It's an absolutely fabulous idea. There might be optical approaches to this, is that you could think about Raman signatures. You know, when somebody says that there are no toxic dyes, how do you know? You just buy a piece of clothing, and I know, for example, I'll give you one example for this, why this resonates with me, is there's a problem that we are working on in Bangladesh that Steve Luby's group discovered. They were starting to find a lot of lead in children's blood, even to a point of extremely toxic levels of lead. Of course, Bangladesh people had found arsenic before, so the intuition was, of course, it's in the water supply. They checked the water everywhere. They couldn't find the source of lead. And after 5 years of testing and trying everything, they discovered the lead was coming from turmeric, which is used in food. So I don't know how many of you use turmeric for cooking. For anybody who makes Indian food knows this. But they were using lead chromate, which is essentially what was used in lead paint, the yellow color, as an artificial color. They didn't know this, but they just wanted the turmeric to look more yellow, which is how people buy turmeric, and you're poisoning an entire population. And so this has become a huge issue right now, and currently it's very difficult to trace. But something that might just feel like, from the person or the sets of people that are doing this, it's like, oh, yes, it's an adulterant, but we didn't know how bad it was. We might find that same set of a scenario play out, primarily because we don't know sometimes even how toxic these sets of things could be. unless these massive clinical studies that happen, and then tracing that back in an environment is difficult. So that's why it resonates with me that this happens in food, but this must also happen in clothing. And the sets of guidelines around it, and also just how do you test whether you have particular dyes that are banned in one places but are still in use. Yeah.
One extension on that is with fire retardants in clothing. I think in the US there's been some regulations on removing brominated based fire retardants. It's also used in bedding a lot, but I don't know.
And then bioretardants are for fire.
Fire retardants.
Yeah. And then I guess it's more and more common now, primarily because of regulations. I know in the lab, for example, like even when we have to put a poster up, we were just putting a poster like that outside the lab, and somebody said you have to coat it with a bioretardant and you can't put the poster up. So, you know, I could see that we overdo this in terms of just, we don't realize the chemical cost of it, and you know, what is the risk that the only risky factor is a poster? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's a fabulous idea. It would actually be fantastic. And it also takes us in a chemical space and a chemical domain, which is also fun to really think about. I can imagine there is one project that I really like from a friend of mine. She's a faculty and missing her name, but she came up with a paper strip approach to detect fake drugs. And it was all based on kind of a colorimetric assay that gives a signature that you expect for a given chemical that she's interested in. So when you buy aspirin, you should have some aspirin in it. And it's a very simple assay to detect whether it has the kind of a compound at the concentration that's advertised. But now I'm thinking, could that be used for detecting the other way around, that if there's a very toxic dye that you really don't want to use and people do a test, and again, you know, many clothes when washed do leach out a ton of that chemical in the first wash, the second wash. And is there an approach to confirm and validate that what you're buying is actually, because it's left a source. So there's no sense of trust associated with it, but I think that would be a really fun place to start. Could we repurpose that technology? I'll send you that paper. There's a beautiful class of papers on the fake drug side of the story. Yeah, I think, Tyler, one thing we should definitely do is let people kind of figure out that let's make these channels as soon as possible.
Yes, I actually just made I made a friend unharmful chemicals channel. So if
but what if just people make their own channels?
We can do that.
Why don't we just do that, and then we can prune out the channels that would, because that way, you know, there shouldn't be a barrier in terms of creating it, and because also the class is smaller this year.
Yeah, I think.
I think last year there were too many channels, but one thing we can do is also then archive much later.
Yeah,
like I would much rather have more conversations happening now rather than later.
Yes, I think so too. I think letting everyone in, like giving everyone that permission will be complex and not ideal, but we can. I'll just be super active and just make as many channels. I'll make like a whole bunch.
Yeah, just so that, I mean, not just the ideas that we discuss. Many people who missed the class might want to, and then many people that are online will see that, oh, project channels are starting.
Yeah.
And why not? If you can just figure out a way that people know that.
Yeah, I'll make that as like the big announcement for this week, is like we're doing projects and everyone will, if you want any project channels.
And then the idea is you don't have to be active just in the projects that you, or the project channel that you're interested in. Browse other people's product channels and give ideas to them. So just go in, like if you're interested, you could go in the polio channel, not that you will join that team, and just say, hey, I've read about this. Have you guys explored that? Just share with each other. Because I think there will be a lot of asynchronous growth of ideas, and then eventually hone in, and then the team that says this is our project will finally have the chance to say, this is the approach we will take. But you should be able to listen in to all kinds of ideas. People might say, oh, I've heard about this specific project that you should read about, or this particular approach that you should read about. So it would be very valuable to have that asynchronous conversation. And that hasn't started yet, right? There's no project conversations yet. Yeah. Okay, any other questions before we disperse for today? Yes.
I'm a little bit confused about Discord versus Notion.
Yeah, Notion you should think as more distilled information. So
That's what the ideas board.
ideas board currently is there, and it is much more in the sense that it's a much organized space. Discord is like the mess of everything. But the notion is that in those messy conversations, Discord should be like a low barrier. You don't have to feel, but then what will happen is that once teams are set and you have a few members that are associated, then you will create a project page, the information that you really want, and you're organized. So Notion is your lab notebook. Discord is just a way to connect with people.
Because under the idea board, there's a place for comments.
That's correct.
That's right.
Yeah,
So we
yeah.
should continue to put comments
You
there.
can continue to put comments, but you will see the Discord discussions will explode. Like suddenly when you said this, I got so excited about it. I was mentioning 10 different things, but that happens for everybody. There are hundreds of people. And then if you really put an idea that just resonates with other people, they will want to engage, and Notion kind of becomes, it breaks the, Notion can't handle that. And all the links and everything else, papers, people will start sharing. And then you use and distill, and then put that distilled information in a project specific page.
Yeah, it's
But-
almost like, I think for me, when I use them, I use Notion as like sort of Google Docs, kind of like collaborative, but mostly like writing information. And then Discord is like me texting my friends, like, yo, I found this, check this out, you know?
Yeah. And also just asynchronously connecting with people,
Yeah.
because I just go on Discord and screen through everything that I missed, and then I'll go back and respond to certain sets of, you can also tag people on Discord. So if you want me to see something, just tag me so that I have a way to just read through every comment that I'm tagged. So this way it kind of is helpful. So if I'm thinking about polio and I make a comment, I'll tag Shweta to just make sure that she sees this. So that's another way. If it feels too much, you can always look for the comments that you're tagged in. And I think, of course, the thread is that there is a group here, but there is a larger group. The more you engage in your teams with the online group, the stronger or the more broader feedback that you will actually get from them as well. And because that will only happen via Discord, essentially. Okay, so I think it's 3:30. We're going to call it a day for today. One comment that I wanted to make, has everybody had the chance to play with any 2D and 3D CAD tools? I think there was a plan to post some tutorials. We could also just do the Teach Me Anything kind of a session. It would be valuable if you're going to dive into making anything. I'm gonna give a talk about the history of Foldscope next week. And just for fun, if people want, I can post the original 2D file of Foldscope and you guys can modify it as a way to learn 2D CAD. It's kind of an historic object. Of course, Foldscope now is very different than the original one, but it's still useful. You'll kind of get a sense for, it's very important. And again, 3D CAD is only possible when you're really good at 2D CAD. 2D CAD is trivial. There's very straightforward things. So if you have never done CAD, that might be a great place to start. We will also be very quickly transitioning into talking about origami. And that's also where we will do a lot of extensive 2D CAD. So this would be something that I don't think we will have time to dedicate in the class or the lab sessions, but let's put a Discord channel just around that. So all the tools are available, some examples are available. There's this thing also called generative CAD, where instead of drawing things line by line, you write programs to build patterns. And there's a huge class of tools associated around that. So I think it would be valuable. Yeah, let's just do that through Discord. And then anybody in the community can then run a session for Teach Me Anything, because these are skills that you just have to put the time. There's not much I can tell. you'll find much better content on YouTube than us organizing anything. And similarly, we can do something very similar to the Arduino side of the story and then just run an online session around Teach Me Anything, because there might be a whole bunch of people on the online community that also would get excited. I'm also thinking of this as a way to choose some time slots that are a little more friendly to the online community. And so these Teach Me Anything sessions, let's be sensitive to the time and see whether it's late night or early morning for us, but is a middle of the day, say, on the other side of the planet.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess we're gonna say bye. I guess I don't know whether we are online here or not. Can you all hear us? I think it's frozen.
Yes, yeah, we can.
Oh, perfect. Okay, we're gonna say bye. And let's catch up on Discord. The goal will be is by the end of next week, at least everybody has committed to at least one project. You can commit to as many projects as you want, but at least start with one project. And then take a look at what's on the ideas channels, but create and then eventually create Discord channels for specific projects that you're all excited about. Also, remember, if there are specific people or areas that you want to hear about, I heard from few sets of folks and I'm rearranging lectures. But if you have a thread or a comment around a project, then I'll make sure that I introduce that earlier rather than later. So I know soil, I heard about STDs, I heard about, so I think those two and women's health, we will include those earlier. But if there are other sets of areas or topics that you felt like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to hear? I think we'll have a few upcoming guest lectures on more ecological side of conservation, sets of folks that have been working on conservation problems. And then we'll have a whole bunch of things on diagnostics, because that's a big push for lots of projects in that space. But if there are areas that people are excited about, at least on the problem space side, just send me a note and I'll think about a person in our community that can engage. Okay, on that note, we'll say bye. I don't think our video is working, but we'll connect on Monday.
All right, thanks everybody. See you.